Okay, we're on Shabbat, Perek Tedvav Mishnah Bet, second Mishnah in the 15th chapter of Shabbat. We're continuing our discussion about Melechet Kosher. So in order to understand this, let's go back to the chart that we started with in the last Mishnah. We learned that there are three types of Kshira. There's Isur D'Oraita, there's Kshira D'Rabbanan, and Kshira that's Muteret, that's permitted. And we saw the position of the Rif and the Rambam that's quoted in the Bartanura, who said that in order to be D'Oraita, it had to be both Kesher Shel Kayama, that's an important phrase, i.e. a Kesher that's meant to last, a permanent tie, and it also has to be what's called Ma'aseh Uman, it has to be the act of a tradesman, somebody who actually knows what they're doing. It has to be a professional tie. Whereas, it's Asur D'Rabbanan if it's either Shel Kayama, permanent, or Ma'aseh Uman and not permanent. It's one of the two. And finally, what's permitted? What's Kesher Mutar? Kesher She'eino Shel Kayama Ve'eino Ma'aseh Uman. That's the position of the Rif and the Rambam. That's quoted in the Bartanura and Mishnah Aleph. Let's now learn Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Bet is going to talk about other types of ties. That's the Mishnah. There are some kinds of ksharim that you're not chayav, i.e. that are asur d'Rabbanan. Remember, chayav means chayav midoraita. You're not chayav kekesher agmalim u kekesher sfanim. You're not chayav on them like the kesher agmalim and like kesher sfanim that we said, the camel tie or the boat mooring, the permanent boat moorings. So what are they? So the Bartanura says, what are lo nizkiru ksharim halal b'mishnah? So the Mishnah is like, well, there are some kind of ties that you're not chayav d'oraita, and go figure out what they are. So the Gemara says, "Ugemara mefaresh kegon ritzua aruka shekoshrin b'tabat shebechotem hana'akar." Remember, we learned in the last Mishnah about the nose tie of the camel. So he says to that, Gemara says there's another rope that you tie to that nose tie. So the nose tie is permanent. You never take it out. It's too much of a pain to tie it on the camel. You got to, get the camel down and tie it down and whatever. But they would untie the rope that's connected to that nose tie. Ukamokein similarly, chevel aroch, a long rope, shekoshrim bechevel asui kemin tabat, that's tied to the tie that's like the ring on the nekeh b'rosh hasfina. It's similar, the very same idea. We learned about in the last Mishnah the boat tie, the permanent tie, the rope that you would tie onto the boat itself. But then you would tie another rope to that tie. Upa'amim menicha sham shavua u'shvuayim u'metira. Sometimes you leave it there a week or two, and you would leave it. V'chein, similarly, kol kesher shekoshrim ota la'amod kach zman yadua. Any tie that's there for some amount of time, lo shiel kayam le'olam, but it's not there permanently, en chayavin alav. You're not chayav on it. So meaning, what's the definition the Bartanura says here? What's the definition of a tie that's asur d'Rabbanan? A kesher that's there for a certain amount of time, an unknown amount of time, but not permanent. So I just want to point out, it's important to point out, whoa, 1 second, Mr. Bartanura, what about Kayama Ma'aseh Uman? Where's the Ma'aseh Uman? He says, a kesher she'eno shel Kayama, she'kashal d'zman mubal, not permanent. That's a totally different opinion. And it just so happens, this is the position of Rashi and the Rush. Okay, the Rashi and the Rush say that the quantification of D'Oraita is kesher shel Kayama, if it's permanent. D'Rabbanan is kesher she'eno shel Kayama. And Rashi doesn't care whether it's Ma'aseh Uman or not Ma'aseh Uman. So and then what's Kesher Amutar? He says, a Kesher Shederech Latiro B'to Yom. If you're going to untie it that day. You tie your shoes, you're going to untie them that day. Okay? So it's very interesting. The Rabbi Akiva Eger points out that the Bartanura in Mishnah Aleph quotes the position of the Rif and the Rambam. But in the Mishnah Bet, the Bartanura quotes the position of the Rashi and the Rush. Why does he switch? You can look it up more deeply, but just notice that Mishnah Bet, the Bartanura, is totally different than the Bartanura of Mishnah Aleph, of what the definition of a permanent tie is. Let's continue. Okay, so that's Yesh Ksharim. We have certain ties that are not like Kesher Gmalim and Kesher Sfanim, that are only patur aval asur. Now we come to what are you allowed to do on Shabbat? What's totally mutar? Kosheret isha miftach chaluka. A woman can tie the ties to her chaluk, to her cloak. They didn't have zippers, they didn't have buttons so much, they had ties, they would tie the cloak up. You're allowed to do that, you're going to untie it that day. V'chutei svacha, svacha we've learned before, that's like her snood, the net that she would wear around her hair, the strings she would tie it so that it would stay on. Psikia, psikia is a belt. I'll show you a belt from Hellenic, it's kind of Hellenic armor. It was like a wide belt that they would use and then they would tie it. So obviously you're going to put it on, you're going to tie it, that's how they would tie their belts, and then they would untie it afterwards. Uritzuak min al sandal, and the straps of the min al shoe and the sandal. The huge machlokot about which straps of shoes and sandals, because remember, in their sandals especially, some of the sandal ties were permanent. Some of them you'd have to tie and untie each day, so you could look it up. Nodot yayin v'shemen, flasks of wine and oil. The flasks of wine and oil had ties in order to close them. It's interesting, if you look for an ancient flask, you'll never find one because all the ancient flasks, they never survived because they were made of leather. They all disintegrated. But you can see the flask had a tie on it, and that's how they would close it. Okay, those are the nodot yayin v'shemen. Similarly, when they would cook their meat, they didn't have pots the way we had. They had cruder pots, and if you wanted to retain its heat, they would tie a cloth on it. They would cover it with a cloth and then tie it. So obviously you would tie it, but you intended to untie it so you could eat your food. Okay. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov also says, I can tie, if I have a gate in the corral or whatever, I can tie a rope in order to prevent the animal from leaving, because obviously I'm going to undo that as well. I'm not going to leave it permanently. Now we're going to come to what happens if I want to draw from a well. This was always an issue for them. And I have the bucket, but you don't want to lose the bucket. So the bucket is connected. Somebody took the rope, and now I have to tie something in order not to lose the bucket. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer, I lost my place. Koshrin deli pipiskiya. So if I want the deli is the bucket at the well. So I could tie the deli, the bucket, with the psikiya. We just saw this psikiya. I could tie it with my belt. Why can I tie it with my belt? Because I need my belt, so I'm not going to leave it. Avalo bechevel. I can't tie it with a rope. Because it's possible that if I tie it with a rope, then I'm going to leave it there, and then it will be a kesher shel kayama. Rabbi Yehuda matir. Rabbi Yehuda permits. How is it possible Rabbi Yehuda permits? So the Bartanura says, interestingly, Rabbi Yehuda matir. So the Gemara explains, Lo hitir Rabbi Yehuda ele bechevel shel gardi. A gardi is an oreg, is a weaver. So the weavers had certain types of ropes. Shetzarich lo lemelachto. He needs that rope. He's never going to leave it there because he needs the rope in order to do his work. He's not going to leave it there permanently. Okay, so therefore, remember we always have this question. When you see a machloket, who seems obvious and who seems interesting? So originally, Rabbi Yehuda matir, why would Rabbi Yehuda allow you to tie with a rope? But now that we understand, let's look, I made you a little chart, because that's what I do, that's my thing. Okay, kosher, delete, piski, everybody says with the belt mutar, that's not permanent. Chevel gardi, if it's a weaver's rope, chachamim say asur, and Rabbi Yehuda says mutar. But if I'm going to need it, then why would Chachamim say asur? So the Bartanura says the reason why the Chachamim say asur is Rabbanan savre, Rabbanan held, isharet lechevel shel gardi. If you permitted the weaver's rope, yikshor naim b'shar chavalim. Other people are going to see him tying. They don't know that he's using it with that rope, or he'll tie with other ropes. Techevel bechevel michla. People switch ropes and ropes. So therefore, Chachamim said even the chevel gardi is asur, and this is the se'iv, this is the part that we're discussing in our Mishnah. This is the machloket in the Mishnah. So when it says chevel, so that's what the Rabbanan said, that when you're allowed to tie in chevel, the Chachamim say asur, Rabbi Yehuda says mutar. But a chevel ragil, a normal rope, everybody says asur because that's going to be permanent. And that's the point of our Mishnah. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda matir, avalo b'chevel, Rabbi Yehuda matir. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda says you're permitted. Klal Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said a rule called kesher she'eno shel kayama. Ein chayavin alav. Any rope, any tie that's not permanent, okay, even with a regular rope, you're not chayav on it. You're not chayav. For this to be all right, and therefore he said a chevel gardi is a derabanan, and therefore a chevel gardi would be permitted. But the Bartanura says halacha kechachamim. We pass them like the chachamim. We'll stop here. As always, if you have comments or questions, feel free to contact me at arspolter@gmail.com. And we'll dedicate a learning to the memory of my father, Simcha ben Yitzchak Kalman. Have a great day.